Germany, at long last, is smashed.
In the final turbulent months of World War II, humanity was caught between carnage and hope. Across the globe, battles raged with brutal intensity, stretching to the limit human endurance and resolve. This is a story of struggle and counter-struggle, of the attempt to forge peace from chaos. It's the story of a whole new world arising from the ashes of the old. This is World War II, the end.
Italy folded fast. Disaster and surrender in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Libya, Tripoli, and Tunisia. Then Pantelleria, and defeat rocked all Italy. Swiftly, Allied victory in Sicily. And greatest shock, bold daylight precision bombing of military targets in Rome itself. The war-weary Italians cried for peace. Dictator Mussolini is gone. 2 more madmen must go. Adolf Hitler will fight long and hard.
At the very end of the war, on the 28th of April 1945, Italian partisans captured Benito Mussolini, the architect of Italian fascism who led Italy through the war. He was trying to flee with his mistress, but they were captured on the shores of Lake Como. One of those who captured Mussolini recalled him having glassy eyes and waxy skin. It was almost as if he wasn't even there.
Again, Mussolini was regarded as a joke. I think all the warring sides regarded the Italian army as not serious. Even in North Africa, where people fought against it, what they said about Italian tanks, so they have 5 reverse gears and only 1 forward gear. Italians, for instance, a few Italians fought with the Germans in Russia, and they tended to either refuse to fight or to surrender straight away. They were notorious for their reluctance to come under fire. So the death of Mussolini, he wasn't regarded as a serious enemy.
The lantern-jawed Italian leader, who fancied himself as the modern reincarnation of the ancient Caesars, could no longer control the Italian people once the Allies had advanced onto their country's soil. Arrested by the forces of the new government, Mussolini was rescued and turned by German paratroopers in a daring raid that saw the ex-Italian dictator make his final escape in a cable car across the Apennine Mountains. From there, a waiting airplane transported him back to a worried Hitler. This meeting showed a marked change over their early ones. The German Fuhrer looked worn and drawn. His rescued partner, stripped of his gaudy uniform and medals, smiled weakly, almost in embarrassment over his inglorious flight. The once mighty Axis combine now faced the dread possibility of ultimate defeat. Returned to control of northern Italy by Hitler, Benito Mussolini was to face a violent end. With his mistress, Italian actress Clara Petacci, he was captured by Italian partisans on an attempted flight to Switzerland in the closing days of the war. A quick court-martial had decided his fate.
By the end of April 1945, Soviet troops had almost encircled Berlin. 2 vast armies of millions of men came into the city in a pincer movement, moving towards the Reichstag and the Führer bunker, where Hitler was still giving out nonsensical orders to long vanquished armies. On the morning of the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide.
Bulletin, Adolf Hitler is dead.
He is dead, and how he died, the world little cares. For Hitler's death, millions have prayed, and millions are now thankful for justice. You hope for life when this man's ideas are dead.
Then Hitler dies. So he dies in this extraordinary Gotterdammerung, where you have the announcement from German radio, which, as they always did, is packaged, so the sonorous music. And then the announcement that Hitler has died, not with a squalid suicide with his mistress, but has died fighting the Bolsheviks. He's died sword in hand. This has to be the case. It's picked up by British analyst listeners, actually by a Jewish refugee from Germany who came over as a teenager. He picks it up. And the message is then given to a man called Ernest Gombrich to translate in his famously bad handwriting. Gombrich is later Sir Ernest Gombrich, most famous, perhaps the most famous art historian of the 20th century. But at this moment, he translates the news of Hitler's death and sends it to the Cabinet Office, and then it's on the BBC. This is how it's actually done. Hitler's motivation was to avoid the death of Mussolini, which happened only about a week before, a little more than that, actually hanging in a town square. This is not for Hitler, and Hitler's orders are that his body then has to be gasoline, something like 40 gallons of petrol are used, so that nothing survives except his jawbone and his teeth. The rest is ash. There is nothing there.
He'd given orders that his corpse should be burnt, but the Soviets made frantic efforts to find any trace of his remains, and they managed to find among the charred body of him and Eva Braun his jawbone, and with dental records, they positively identified that this was the corpse of Adolf Hitler.
News control was pretty strict in the Soviet Union, but there was a breach in it, largely because of the collaboration with the British and the Americans. The British, for instance, had a weekly journal called Anglia, England, and it did give a brief summary of news from a BBC point of view rather than a Soviet point of view. Major cities where this magazine circulated soon found out about it, and very shortly afterwards it was denied. Stalin had actually better knowledge, forensic knowledge, that the corpse, the burnt corpse they found, was Hitler's, because he met one of the forensic scientists who examined the teeth and so on. So he knew perfectly well that Hitler was dead. But he ordered Marshal Zhukov, one of the main military leaders, in June, just a month later, in a press conference to say that they had no proof of Hitler's death. They thought he was alive, possibly in Europe. The implication being that the Allies were keeping Hitler alive and that they hadn't finished the job. And when Clement Attlee came to see Stalin, it turned out that Attlee too believed that Hitler might be alive. So this news of Hitler's death was announced and then denounced. And it isn't until 1951 that it became official in the Soviet Union that Hitler was definitely dead.
Out of the fog and smoke of the Western Front and the partial blackout of news, peace rumors sweep America as the amazing drive to Berlin races ahead. With every day, every hour, the borders of the Reich shrink back. And from the east come new films of the Russian offensive, the first to reach America in months. $20 million Germans are in flight as the smoke of defeat clouds all Germany.
The Battle of Berlin was the decisive and last battle of World War II as far as the Western theatre was concerned. Stalin poured hundreds of thousands of men into the battle. Berlin was firstly bombarded, especially by what were known as Stalin's organs. These were multiple rocket launchers, which looked like organs indeed. And they were, of course, quite extraordinarily destructive weapon to literally decimate Berlin. But it then had to be taken. The extraordinary thing about Nazi Germany is the way it was defended to the last, street by street. It's a great enigma. So the system continued into being. You couldn't get people to surrender very easily. They would sometimes, quite often, fight until the last. The SS continued to man the rear and strike terror into the civic population. Any sign of surrender, people were hanged from the lampposts, quite literally. So Berlin had to be taken street by street. It was an incredible battle, a horrific battle.
On the following day, May the 1st, the red flag was hoisted ceremoniously over the Reichstag. It marked the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich. Hitler's regime was finally at an end, and the Second World War was also nearing its end.
Outside Montgomery's headquarters south of Hamburg, war's end for German armies in the north. Coldly, the British leader lays down his terms, unconditional surrender. The Nazi generals go off to consider. They offered to surrender to the Western Allies, but not to the Russians. Monty refused, saying, "If you do not agree, I will go on with the war and be delighted to do so." At 6:25 p.m., the surrender is finally and officially accomplished.
The German delegation will now sign this paper, and they will sign in order of seniority, and General Admiral von Friedeberg will sign first.
As flashbulbs pop, the head of the German Navy puts his signature to the order, delivering 1 million Germans into British and Canadian hands.
Now, I will sign the instrument on behalf of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower.
On the 7th of May 1945, in a modest schoolhouse in the French city of Reims, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. 6 years of war was finally at an end. General Eisenhower celebrated modestly with his aides, drinking a glass of champagne, and then prepared to break the news to the world.
The Red Schoolhouse at Reims, France, as peace is signed with German General Jodl acting for the remnants of the Nazi government. Jodl, for a few hours, was the chief of staff of the German army, while de Fuhrer's successor, Admiral Dönitz, was strangely missing. This is the news that electrified the world: unconditional surrender.
The unconditional surrender is making a point. In 1918, 1919, there was no unconditional surrender. The Germans of that era therefore propagated the myth of the stab in the back, that they hadn't been defeated. They're defeated by a piece of chicanery. So you really had to have unconditional surrender for two reasons. Firstly, to demonstrate to the world and to Germans that they had been fully defeated and surrendered. And secondly, that there was no possibility of a faction within Germany continuing the war in the East and surrendering to the Allies in the West. That possibility was always there, but the Allied political leadership were quite determined that there should never be a hint of that, so that the surrender would be total, and the surrender would be both to the Western Allies and the Soviet Union.
When the world learned of victory, it erupted in celebration on the 8th of May, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day.
A few moments later, General Eisenhower, who has not been present at the signing, gets a broad grin and the victory sign from two Russian officers. He replies with the fountain pens used in the surrender, then honors all the men who won victory in Europe.
To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million Allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid. The only repayment that can be made to them is a deep appreciation and lasting gratitude of all free citizens of all the United Nations.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hail the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland. Years full of suffering and death and sacrifice. Now the war against Germany is won.
I remember on the day it actually happened, we had a street parade, and I remember going around the streets with dustbin lids, banging the dustbin lids. Everybody dancing in the streets.
The children were all waiting for their dads to come home from the war. So we all made placards, "Welcome home, Dad." My dad was one of the last in the street to get home. I do remember that, and of course then came the street parties.
Well, we had a massive party, you know, in the street, and everybody took something. And I remember my dad, they had like a big pole, and they greased it from top to bottom with real grease. And you could, who got to the top? And I remember my father going with his pyjamas on up this greasy pole. And I remember there was a bit of wood, and I tap danced on the bit of wood to all these people. So it was wonderful, wonderful.
The news is received that the Germans have surrendered, and it leads to a spontaneous outpouring of public emotion, far more so than victory in Japan, VJ Day, because they know that the immediate threat is over, and not only in Britain, but all over Europe. And remember, the threat continued in being to the very last. We have this idea that the war entered a low key as Allied armies entered Germany. Civilians in this country, in Britain, could not breathe at night comfortably. There was still an aerial threat manifest in the V1 and the V2. For my grandfather's sister, for example, it meant that 6 weeks before the end of World War II, at her lovely Georgian farmhouse in Kent, about March the 23rd, 1945, a V2 exploded nearby. It killed her, sister-in-law. Our son woke up in hospital to hear people talking about the two dead ladies. So the threat was there, particularly from the V-bombs.
The Red Army soldiers who returned home were, in general, welcomed by their communities. They were only too anxious to be demobilized. Some of them, unfortunately, were kept on to hold down Eastern Europe, or just in case they were needed for the future Korean War that was about to break out. But there were certain categories who found it very difficult coming home. They had to go through filtration. If you'd been a prisoner of war, even if you managed to escape and return to your own men, you went through a filtration camp to check that you weren't now a foreign spy, and that could end very badly. If you belonged to certain nationalities, particularly in the Caucasus, that had been declared criminal, then you weren't allowed to go home. You were sent into exile or worse. So there was a certain amount of trepidation, Red Army soldiers going home. You weren't absolutely sure that you'd be demobilized or reunited with your family. You had to pass through these various filtration processes. If you were a general, however, particularly in the East, then you had a wonderful time. There were trains full of German cattle being taken to the general's dacha back in Russia. All over Russia there were Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs and so on, trophy cars.
So VE Day, we have a unique event, a politician appearing with the royal family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and that is Churchill. It's an extraordinary occasion, but the sheer weight and volume of the crowds, but as I say, it's not just celebrating the end of the war. It's actually celebrating life itself and the life force, because they know that they're safe. They're not going to be killed. Not all of them. The troops fighting in the Far East, in Burma and in the Pacific, and remember the British ships in the Pacific as well. It's not over for them, and Churchill has to kind of slightly dampen the super party atmosphere by saying it's not over. The war is continuing in the East. We must continue our resolve until that's finished.
But amidst the jubilation was the realization of millions of lives that had been lost, and towns and cities across Europe had been utterly pulverized.
But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued.
I've come to the Berlin suburb of Potsdam, to the Cecilienhof Palace, former home of the German imperial family. It was here, in the summer of 1945, that three wartime leaders, Churchill, Truman and Stalin, met to plan the future of Europe and the future of the world.
The Potsdam Conference ostensibly had been called in the spirit of cooperation and peace between the three major powers of the world. From it was anticipated the emergence of a design for living that would assure civilization and existence free from a third world war. Two of the partners were sincere in their efforts to negotiate for peace. The third was to prove himself suspect in the eyes of the world.
The three leaders had a great deal to discuss. Churchill seated here, Truman there, and Stalin over there. They discussed the division of Germany, the division of Berlin, the future fate of Eastern and Central Europe, and of course, the ongoing war in Japan. Truman wanted Stalin to sign up to help with the fighting. And all of these things would be enshrined in the future Potsdam Agreement. But one huge secret loomed over everything. Truman was brought word that American scientists had successfully detonated the atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico. America was a nuclear power. Truman informed Stalin of this fact and was surprised that Stalin hardly batted an eyelid. There was good reason for this. Stalin's spies had infiltrated the Manhattan Project and knew every detail of America's nuclear program.
I think that Stalin and his agents were very deeply infiltrated into the Manhattan Project. There was not just Oppenheimer, but Fuchs and many others who were reporting on what was happening there. Although they tried to have extreme security, it wasn't good enough, given the power of the Soviet secret police and the spies they recruited in Canada, Britain, and the United States. There were too many emigres with loyalties to Eastern Europe, with family in Eastern Europe, for this to be waterproof. What Stalin lacked was the materials to make an atom bomb. And once he'd conquered Germany, they had the bismuth, they had the uranium, and they also had the heavy water that they needed. It was just a matter of the materials and setting up the factories to assemble them.
By the time the three wartime leaders met here in Potsdam, a great deal had changed. President Roosevelt had died a few months earlier and been replaced by his Vice President Truman, who turned up to the conference dressed in a natty business suit and polka dot tie. He looked for all the world like the chairman of an American corporation. Churchill was still here, smoking his big fat trademark cigar. But Churchill would lose the British general election a week into the conference. He would return to England, never to return. He was replaced by the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee.
Well, that came as a shock to the people because Winston Churchill had done a wonderful job all through the war, kept people's spirits up, and when there was a landslide Labour victory and Clement Attlee was put in, a lot of people felt very sorry for Winston Churchill.
Stalin alone remained of the big three who had started the war. Stalin, dressed in his marshal's uniform, the old war horse, the killer of millions of his own people. Stalin was determined to be the winner of the Potsdam Conference. He was determined to get what he really wanted, the whole of Eastern and Central Europe under his control.
Well, Potsdam is a town just outside Berlin, historically symbolic as the home of the German army officer corps. The garrison church at Potsdam was where the Third Reich was inaugurated. So it had a similar symbolism to Nuremberg. The Potsdam Conference has meaning. It's actually determining the role Russia will play in the war in the East and how they're going to defeat Japan, what are the various quid pro quos of this alliance and how Russia is going to join it in the East now the war in the West has finished. So it's also obviously tying up loose ends within Europe too. But the focus is very much the East and Russia's participation.
When Stalin came to Potsdam, he was really very happy and pleased with himself. He was the winner. He was the only participant who was healthy and well briefed. His spies had told him a great deal that the Allies didn't know he knew. He had already got the Yalta Agreement, and he was determined that he was not going to give anything back. I suspect that Stalin already knew that Churchill had drawn up or commissioned a plan called the unthinkable, and he'd probably dismissed it. Stalin had plenty of spies, some who worked for money, some who worked out of idealism, some who worked out of sheer habit from the war of telling the Russians everything we knew. Unthinkable had two unthinkable things about it. The first was that as Poland had been so badly treated by the Allies as well as by Russia, that elements of the German army could be revived with the British army and the American army, and a quick war waged on the Red Army in Poland so that Poland could be liberated and perhaps restored to its original frontiers. The British military advised Churchill that this was unlikely to work, that the military was tired and worn out. Unthinkable, too, was to wage a defensive war on the North Sea coast and the Atlantic coast in case Stalin decided to push the Red Army further west and conquer the whole of Europe, which was a serious fear, as he had all the men there, and he still had reserves, and he still had plenty of armament left. But in fact, Stalin had no intention to go further west. He needed to consolidate what he had and hold down, and he also had plans for the Far East, for China and for Korea.
In the 6th year of the Second World War, a single bomb destroyed the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Its stone, etched by heat, which reached thousands of degrees, a monument recorded the passage of the blast. And burned into the pavement was the silhouette of one of the many who perished on that fateful day.
On the 6th of August, 1945, there came an event that would change the course of history. It was 8:15 in the morning, and there was a blinding flash and deafening roar as the center of Hiroshima was pulverized and thousands of Japanese were instantly vaporized. And in the days and weeks to come, many thousands more were to die of radiation sickness. The bomb was known as Little Boy, and soon after its detonation, the Americans would issue a statement. The United States has today dropped on Hiroshima, an important Japanese military center, an atomic bomb. The bomb has been developed by the United States in cooperation with its allies. We are now prepared to continue the war with the use of this new weapon. And prepared they were. Just 3 days later, they dropped another bomb on the city of Nagasaki.
Well, of course, everybody in those days listened to the radio. There was no television, so everyone was automatically, you listened to every newscast, which was about 4 times a day, and it came over the radio, and no one quite knew the devastation until a couple of days later, when the newspapers started to print pictures taken from the air and from the ground of this terrible destruction. I mean, it literally devastated, absolutely flattened 2 cities, tens of thousands of people. The worst thing was the radiation from the atom bomb, which spread for probably 5 miles in each direction, and it killed people by the thousands. But looking back, you thought, that's a terrible thing. We hope that it never happens. We hoped that the war was the war to end all wars.
The war ends with a great and historic amen, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nagasaki, far fewer deaths because it's enclosed by hills and mountains. Hiroshima, we don't really know how many people are vaporized. Figures have put up to 130,000. But it is, in the end, this terrible tension between the rational and the ethical. The rational says, end the war finally and completely, and do so by this monstrosity, because if you don't, Japan will continue. MacArthur has said that 1 million American troops will be casualties. There were those who, within Truman's cabinet, who actually opposed the dropping of the bomb. Not everyone was for it. It was a contested decision. But that decision was made, and made by Truman probably without much moral urgency, because he was able to, as was nearly everyone else, to rationalize the whole thing, and rationalize one can.
The Soviets were pretty confident they would have the bomb. Stalin held a conference and asked how long it would take. And some of his physicists said 15 years. And Stalin said, in 4. And it was done in 4. It is said that his chief acolyte, Lavrenti Beria, who was the sort of Albert Speer in his competence, who helped Stalin do all this, organized it so well. He had a little black book, which had a list of the rewards that the physicists would get if the bomb was detonated successfully in time, and on the other page a list of punishments they would get if it wasn't. And they all knew that.
On the very same day as the bombing of Nagasaki, a dramatic event took place in the Far East. The Soviet Red Army invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria. 1 million troops poured over the frontier, and the Japanese army collapsed. The emperor realized that it was the end of his empire, and it was almost the end of the war. He was prepared to capitulate. But before he did so, there was an attempted coup d'etat by officers who were resolutely opposed to Japan surrendering. The coup d'etat failed, and the stage was set for Japan to surrender.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment.
On the 15th of August 1945, the Emperor of Japan made an historic radio broadcast. He announced Japan's surrender. He spoke of unendurable suffering and said that Japan itself would now have to endure the unendurable. The surrender came in the wake of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and of the entry of the Soviet Red Army into the war against Japan. Surrender marked the end of the Japanese Empire, but more importantly, it marked the end of World War II.
Japanese militarists or super militarists were many of them determined to continue the war. But because Japanese had an imperial structure, it was not only an empire in the Western sense with an emperor, but it was more than that. The emperor was a god and therefore was not just admired as we admired her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but she was not a god. She was admired, but she was not revered in that hyperbolic sense, whereas he was. And so he had a degree of command at this point in time, which no leader has ever had in history, because he was godlike as well as human. So when he said, "The war is over," the war was over.
Newsmen rushed the president's report to a waiting world, and through the early evening, Tuesday, August 14th, the fateful news is flashed. In New York City, as throughout a rejoicing nation and world, vast throngs of grateful, happy people celebrate the end of fighting, the dawn of peace. 2 million New Yorkers jam Times Square. It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
On the 2nd of September 1945, after 4 years of brutal war in the Pacific Theater, Japan finally surrendered. Japanese officials boarded the USS Missouri at anchor in Tokyo Bay and signed the Declaration of Surrender. This was marked by jubilation around the world, Victory over Japan Day, or VJ Day. In New York, thousands gathered and the famous kiss photograph was taken. In San Francisco, the celebrations were so intense that the entire electricity network was knocked out. And in London, tens of thousands of people gathered outside Buckingham Palace to witness King George VI and his family on the famous balcony. The young princesses, including the future Queen Elizabeth II, later slipped out and mingled amongst the joyous crowd, and the Queen would later remark that it was one of the most memorable days of her life. In the wake of victory, it was time to count the costs. Some 27 million Soviet soldiers had lost their lives on the Eastern Front, 450,000 Americans and 400,000 British soldiers had also been killed. And the Axis powers had also had their share of fatalities. 4 million Germans had died on the battlefront and 2.5 million Japanese. In the wake of victory, the American General MacArthur took over the running of Japan and oversaw the general process of turning it into a democratic society. In Europe, millions of displaced civilians and tens of thousands of prisoners of war returned to homes and cities, only to find that they'd been reduced to rubble. Ethnic Germans, too, millions of them, were now cleansed from the territories now run by the Red Army. They were left as homeless, desperate refugees. Economies of Europe, the cities of Europe, everything needed to be rebuilt.
A world shocked beyond belief sees the barbaric work of the dying Nazi beast. In the horror of such headlines, Berlin's fall and the joining of the two fronts are almost overshadowed. Then an invitation from General Eisenhower at the front sends editors and congressmen on a flying trip to view atrocities at first hand. Some of what they will see inside the Reich has already been recorded, like Kaunitz concentration camp, where 30,000 Russians lie in unmarked graves. At notorious Buchenwald, over 150,000 starved, tortured, gassed, shot, burned, or bayoneted.
As the victorious nations looked ahead to the future, preparations began for the famous Nuremberg trials, in which the senior architects of the Third Reich would be put on trial for crimes against humanity. These trials promised a new era of justice and international law. There was a real hope and optimism for the future, that the Second World War had been the war to end all wars, that there was now a new beginning, and that there would never be another war like World War II.
Well, the question of whether wars ever end is an interesting one. I mean, Milton once wrote, for what can war but endless war still be? And there is a sense that all wars are the same war. If you look at the First World War and Second, to what extent were they a continuity of the Franco-Prussian War? To what extent were they continuities of the war between the German states and Napoleon? To what extent does that derive from Frederick the Great? It's a kind of, in a sense, the same war. Every war reaches a peace. You have peace treaties, but certain within the fabric of the peace treaty are the seeds, that isn't to mix my metaphor, of the next war.
There's a collection of documents collected by the secret police of what people were thinking would happen at the end of the war. And the general belief was that the intellectuals would be rewarded for their loyalty by freedom of press, freedom to travel, freedom to read what they like and write what they like. The peasants were convinced that as they'd served as soldiers, that they would be rewarded for their loyalty by being allowed to own the land and farm it and sell the produce, that the collective farms would be disbanded and they would be allowed freedom of movement and they'd be allowed to sell food and buy goods. So that was the big illusion, which was, of course, very, very quickly shattered. So that was part of the joy, and of course the return of the menfolk, the idea that it would now be possible to work without total exhaustion.
I mean, whenever you make these programs now, I think there's a certain nervous edge. Because suddenly we're, on the edge of the volcano, and all these things which seemed done and dusted and dead in history now seem very much alive. Suddenly we're transported back to the emotions of those eras.
The human cost was staggering, but so was the determination to ensure that the world would never again be engulfed in such a conflict.